So, hi again, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture in the last minute tip lecture series for the 2025 bar exam. In this session, we'll focus on some key concepts and updates from recent jurisprudence in labor law, which is part of the Day 2 afternoon bar exam this coming September 10th. So, let's start. First, let's discuss a topic under recruitment and placement of workers. The seafarers claim for disability benefits. Later on, we'll cover a 2023 ruling of the Supreme Court which set some guidelines on these claims. The recruitment and employment of seafarers are governed by the 2016 POEA Rules and Regulations governing the recruitment and employment of seafarers. Although the powers and functions of the POEA are now absorbed or consolidated with the Department of Migrant Workers, these 2016 rules still govern. And these 2016 rules mandated the formulation of a standard employment contract for seafarers, which shall contain the minimum terms and conditions of the seafarers' employment. Pursuant to this, the POEA formulated the Seafarers Standard Employment Contract, and one of the most litigated provisions in that contract is regarding the seafarers' claim for compensation for work-related injury or illness. So that's found in Section 20. The rule is, if the seafarer suffered work-related injury or illness, he may claim disability benefits from the employer. But there are certain requirements. Number one, within 3 days pagkabalik niya sa Pilipinas, the seafarer must submit to a post-employment medical examination by a company-designated physician. If the seafarer is physically incapacitated, he shall send a written notice to the employment agency within the same 3 days also. If the seafarer fails to comply with these requirements, then his benefits will be forfeited. But if you've watched one of our Q&As based on the case of Karan versus Grieg Philippines, a 2021 decision penned by the bar chair, the Supreme Court held that the 3-day rule is not absolute and it may be excused for valid reasons. In that case, there's a valid reason kaya hindi nakapag-report agad yung seafarer to the company doctor. Kasi na-hospitalize agad siya and he needed urgent surgery. In any case, in-inform naman ng wife niya yung employer about his condition. So, the Supreme Court held in that case that even if the seafarer failed to strictly observe the 3-day rule, hindi dapat ma-forfeit yung disability benefits niya. Since justified naman yung failure to comply given the seafarer's physical inability and the employer was duly notified through the wife. The disability benefits that seafarers can claim can either be total or partial, and permanent or temporary. But who determines that? It is the company designated doctor as a general rule. But sometimes there's a conflict because of course the seafarer wants to claim total and permanent disability benefits para mas malaki yung amount of the benefit na ma-claim niya. But the company doctor would sometimes assess that the disability is partial lang or temporary lang, or the doctor may even claim na hindi naman work-related yung injury or illness. So sometimes the seafarer gets a second opinion from a different doctor, not the one that is company designated. And ito yung nagiging usual subject of cases. If magkaiba yung findings ng company doctor and the seafarer's doctor. So the seafarer's doctor may say that the seafarer suffered total and permanent disability. Tapos yung company doctor will say na hindi. Partial lang yan or temporary lang. To address this issue, meron namang provision in the standard employment contract saying that the seafarer and the company can designate a third or an independent doctor jointly. And the decision or the finding of that doctor will be final and binding. It is in this context that the Supreme Court rendered its decision in Bunayog versus Foscon Ship Management. It's a 2023 case where the Supreme Court set guidelines in cases where the seafarer requests referral to a third doctor. The assumption for these guidelines is that there's already a result from both the company doctor and the seafarer's doctor. According to the Supreme Court in this case, these are the guidelines. Number one, the seafarer must send a written request to the employer to refer the conflicting medical findings to a third doctor. And that request should contain the medical findings of his doctor. Either the medical report is attached or nakadetail sa mismong letter yung findings. If wala yung medical findings, then the request is considered invalid. If there's no valid written request from the seafarer, then the employer can ignore the findings of his doctor and the findings of the company physician will be final. Unless, of course, it has no scientific basis or it's not supported by the seafarer's medical records. If there's a valid written request and the seafarer and the employer are able to agree on a third doctor, then the finding of that third doctor is final and binding. But what if there's no agreement? What if the seafarer and the employer cannot agree on a third doctor? The remedy to that is for the seafarer to file a complaint for the disability benefits with the labor arbiter. And the labor arbiters will consider both findings. So si labor arbiter na yung mag-assess or magdedetermine which of the conflicting findings is more reliable. Another situation. What if there's a valid written request but the employer ignores it or does not want to refer the case to a third doctor? This situation is considered a violation of the POEA standard employment contract, and the seafarer can file a complaint against his employer. So, in that complaint, the labor arbiter will give the parties the opportunity to secure a third doctor. And if they are able to do so, then the findings of that third doctor will be binding. Pero if wala pa din talaga, what will be considered is the finding of either the seafarer's doctor or the company doctor. Depende kung kaninong fault kaya nagkaroon ng failure to secure a third doctor. If fault ng company, then the finding of the seafarer's doctor will become final. If fault naman ng seafarer, the findings of the company doctor will become final. Unless again, the finding of either doctor is without basis or clearly biased. Okay, let's move on to termination by employer. Just causes for the dismissal of an employee. This is enumerated in Article 297, formerly 282 of the Labor Code. And this is one of the frequently asked topics in the bar exam. So let's start with recalling what the just causes for dismissal are. When we say just cause, so it implies that the employee committed some violation against the employer. So do you still remember our mnemonic for this? WAGBOSS. So it stands for willful disobedience by the employee of the employer's lawful orders in connection with his work, analogous causes, gross and habitual neglect by the employee of his duties, breach by the employee of the employer's trust, offense committed by the employee against his employer or immediate members of his family or his duly authorized representatives, and serious misconduct. For willful disobedience, remember that the order disobeyed by the employee must be lawful and reasonable. It must also be communicated to the employee, so either through memoranda, posting in the bulletin board, or emails. Of course, the employee cannot be faulted for not following a rule that he does not know about. And the order must also relate to the employee's duties. For example, sales manager ka tapos inutusan ka ng boss mo to babysit her 2-year-old child. You disobeyed. Can you be held liable or can you be dismissed for willful disobedience? No, because hindi naman related sa duties ng employee yung order that he disobeyed, and the employee has the right to refuse it. If the employee is dismissed on that ground, then that's illegal dismissal because there's no just cause. Next, analogous causes. One of the most commonly cited analogous cause is abandonment. So, abandonment is considered analogous to neglect of duty. There is abandonment if the employee fails to report to work without a valid reason. And more importantly, he performed some overt act showing that he has no intention of returning back to work. What if the employee was demoted? From manager, pinagawa siya ng clerical duties. So, because of that, hindi na siya nag-report sa office. Instead, nag-file siya ng complaint for constructive dismissal with the labor arbiter. Is that considered abandonment of work? So, in one case, JS Unitrade versus Samson, the Supreme Court, through Justice Lazaro Javier, said that that's not considered abandonment. And the fact that the employee filed a complaint for constructive dismissal shows the intent to contest the management's actions of demoting him instead of abandoning his job. Another question. Yung pag-air ng grievances ng employees, maybe through social media, kasi ito yung uso ngayon. Mga nagra-rant on Facebook or X or other platforms. Is that analogous to any of the just cause? Is that a valid ground for dismissal? Probably not, since that's merely an exercise of the employee's right to freedom of expression. But what if it's in the rules of the company na bawal mag-post ng grievances on social media? If the employee violated that rule, can he be dismissed? Well, my opinion is that rule in itself is questionable as infringing freedom of speech. So you can argue that the order is not lawful or reasonable. So its violation cannot be a valid ground for dismissal. In gross and habitual neglect, the first consideration is that the neglect of the employee's duty must be both gross and habitual. But there's a 2009 case, it's LBC versus Mateo, and the Supreme Court held in that case na kahit hindi habitual, but the employee is grossly negligent, he can still be validly dismissed. In that case, the employee is a delivery rider of LBC. So binigyan siya ng company motorcycle for his deliveries. Nakarnap yung motorcycle na yon kasi iniwan niya along Escolta, Manila to drop off a package at an LBC branch. Kinuha niya yung susi, but he failed to lock the motorcycle steering wheel. According to him, he was only absent for about 3 to 5 minutes. This is what the Supreme Court said. Although Mateo's infraction was not habitual, so it's a one time thing, we must take into account the substantial amount lost. So LBC lost a motorcycle worth 46,000, which is not a trivial amount. Mateo's gross negligence should not allow him to walk away from that incident as if nothing happened. In another 2024 case naman, the Supreme Court held that carelessness and inefficiency in performing tasks can be considered neglect of duties if habitual. Next ground is the breach of trust or fraud, and this requires that the employee must be holding a position of trust and confidence. These are usually the managerial employees, since they have the power to lay down and to implement management policies. They may even have the authority to make employee decisions like hiring or firing, transfer or reassignment of employees, or they can even impose disciplinary sanctions. They are the department heads, branch managers, although the title is not controlling. What we need to look at is the functions or the authority of the employee. But this ground for dismissal is not limited to managerial employees. There are also what we call the fiduciary rank and file employees. So, although they are rank and file, these employees handle significant amounts of the employer's money or property in the course of their duties. And those duties still require high degree of trust even if they are not exercising managerial discretion. Example of these positions are cashiers, bank tellers, or property custodian. In the restaurant industry, there's a position called the captain waiter. So it's a rank and file employee performing fiduciary duties. In one of the cases penned by the bar chair, so that case is the Peninsula Manila versus Jara, a captain waiter there was dismissed for breach of trust of the employer. In that case kasi, the captain waiter is tasked to reconcile cash collections with transaction receipts. He found that there was excess cash of 6,500. Pero hindi niya binalik agad. Nilagay lang niya sa locker niya, and in his report, he made it appear na walang excess cash. Binalik niya naman yung cash after several days, but instead of returning it to his supervisor, he returned it to the head waitress. The Supreme Court that the waiter was validly dismissed in that case for breach of the employer's trust, even if he is a rank and file employee, because his tasks require high degree of trust and confidence from the employer, since he handles cash collections and reconciles it with the receipts. Also note that even if binalik niya yung cash, the Supreme Court still upheld the dismissal as valid. Because if you go back to the facts again, it is not just the late return of the excess cash. He also falsified a report and made it appear that there was no excess cash. And he should have returned the cash to his supervisor. So, considering the totality of the circumstances, the court said that the employer is justified in dismissing the employee since the employer cannot be forced to keep an employee who he no longer trusts. Next ground is an offense against the employer, his family, or representative. If this is the ground for the dismissal of an employee, is conviction of the offense required? The answer is no. Conviction of the offense is not required before the employee can be dismissed on this ground. And even if the employer should drop the criminal charges against the employee, this will still not stop or prevent the employer from exercising this right to dismiss the employee. Because remember, in labor cases, these are administrative in nature. So the required quantum of evidence is only substantial evidence, not proof beyond reasonable doubt. The last ground is serious misconduct. So this ground requires that the misconduct must be serious and it must be related to the employee's duties. So actually kasama ito nung willful breach of trust in the labor code provision. What are some examples of serious misconduct? So sexual harassment, that's serious misconduct. Substance abuse, engaging in scandalous acts. In case of teachers, we have one case, St. Benedict Childhood Education Center versus San Jose, penned by the bar chair. So that case involved a preschool teacher. So hindi niya pinayagan yung student niya, a 5-year-old child, na mag-restroom break twice. And the child wet his pants and after that, pinahiya niya pa yung bata by calling him a liar in front of the class, which led to teasing by his classmates. The teacher in that case was dismissed for serious misconduct and the Supreme Court upheld the dismissal as valid. The Supreme Court said that the Teachers Act constitutes serious misconduct, considering that the child was of tender years. He's just 5 years old, and it relates to the teacher's duty to protect the student's welfare. The court also said that long years of service, 27 years kasi yung service ng teacher in this case, it does not justify the Teachers Act and no matter how long the service was, it cannot be used to wipe out the teacher's infractions. Next, let's look at some examples from 2024 cases. What if the employee tested positive for HIV? Is that alone sufficient to dismiss the employee? The Supreme Court said that it is illegal to dismiss an employee based solely on the fact that he or she tested positive for HIV. The Supreme Court even said that such termination is discriminatory. How about if a teacher got pregnant out of wedlock? Is that a ground to suspend the teacher? Again, the Supreme Court said that it is not a valid ground for suspension, more so dismissal. The court in that case said that sexual relations between two unmarried consenting adults are neither illegal nor immoral. So next, let's talk about the due process requirement for dismissals for just cause. We have the twin notice requirement. And when we talk of these notices, these are written notices, not just verbal warnings or reprimand. Notice number one. The first notice should inform the employee of his specific acts or omissions constituting the ground for the dismissal. They should be specific para alam din ni employee how to properly defend himself against the allegations. And it should also require the employee to submit a written explanation within a reasonable time from the receipt of the notice. So that reasonable time should not be less than 5 calendar days. So notice number two. So it is the employer's decision to dismiss the employee. What is the effect if there really is a just cause for the dismissal of the employee? but the employer failed to observe the due process requirement. Does the dismissal become illegal? Is the employee now entitled to reinstatement? Under case law, even if the employer failed to observe the due process requirement, as long as the dismissal is for a just cause, then it remains valid. But the employer is liable for nominal damages for violating the employee's right to due process. Basta what's important is that there is just cause. If there's no just cause, even if there's observance of due process, the dismissal is still illegal. Next is the doctrine of constructive dismissal. Constructive dismissal is illegal dismissal in disguise. So it occurs when the employee's work is involuntarily terminated because continued employment is rendered impossible, unreasonable, or unlikely. It may be due to clear discrimination, insensibility, indifference, or other improper treatment of the employee that leaves him no choice but to resign. Technically, the employee is not fired or dismissed, but he is forced to resign because the work conditions are unbearable. In Bartolome versus Toyota, a decision penned by the bar chair, the Supreme Court ruled that there's constructive dismissal if the employee was forced to resign due to demotion, verbal abuse, and indifferent behavior of the employer. The employee in that case is a car sales agent, and the company president humiliated him in a meeting. His accounts were also transferred to other agents without explanation, and his manager refused to sign sales proposals. The standard for constructive dismissal is whether a reasonable person in the employee's position would have felt forced to resign under the circumstances. In another case, the Supreme Court ruled that in constructive dismissal cases, if the employer claims that the employee resigned, then the employer must prove by substantial evidence that the employee's resignation was voluntary. So, in other words, the employer has the burden of proving the resignation and that it's voluntary. Next, let's discuss the right to peaceful concerted activities. So, this is a guarantee under the Constitution, specifically under Article 13 on labor, but it can also be covered by the general provision on the freedom of speech and expression under the Bill of Rights. When we speak of peaceful concerted activities in labor law context, we refer to the right to strike and picketing. And these are rights of legitimate labor organizations or labor unions. Strike is the temporary stoppage of work due to a labor dispute. So the employees stop reporting for work. And this is a concerted activity, meaning a group of employees, usually part of a labor unions. They will all stop going to work. Picketing, on the other hand, is simply an exercise of freedom of expression. So, this is where employees march or maybe stand in front of the company building or within the premises of the company, carrying placards, banners, or streamers or other signs to express or to make it known that there's a labor dispute. Let's focus on the right to strike. First question, pwede bang mag-strike ang government employees? So no, they cannot. Government employees, including employees of government-owned and controlled corporations with original charter, are prohibited from staging a strike. So that's under Executive Order 180. Although government employees can join or form labor organizations or unions, they do not have the right to strike. But doesn't that violate the Constitution? It does not, because under the Constitution, the grant of the right to strike is qualified. So the Constitution says that the right to strike must be in accordance with law. So it means that the right to strike can be regulated by law. And there's also a public policy consideration behind the prohibition. So that is to prevent the disruption of the delivery of public service. A strike can be legal or illegal. A strike is legal if number one, it is staged for a valid ground. Number two, it complied with the procedural requirements. Number three, it is carried out through lawful means. And number four, it is not in violation of agreements providing for arbitration. So the first one, what are the valid grounds for a strike? So a strike can be staged for a bargaining deadlock. Number one. So bargaining deadlock means that the management and the union cannot agree in their collective bargaining. Number two, unfair labor practice. So this one includes gross violation of the economic provisions of the collective bargaining agreement. So what are economic provisions? These are provisions giving employees benefits, maybe in terms of wages, bonuses, allowances, leave benefits, among others. If the employer refuses to give these benefits, even if it's agreed upon in the collective bargaining agreement, then it is a ground for staging a strike. Another one, in a 2024 case, the Supreme Court held that it is an unfair labor practice for the employer to withhold union fees pursuant to a check of profession in the collective bargaining agreement. And number three, union busting. It's said to be the worst form of unfair labor practice. So it means the dismissal of union leaders or officers which threatens the union. It is the worst form of unfair labor practice because it interferes with the right of the employees to serve organization. So baka matakot na silang gumawa or mag-lead ng unions if they know there's a possibility that they might lose their job. If a strike is staged without a valid ground, it is illegal. There's also a procedural requirement before a strike can be conducted. So including the filing of notice with the National Conciliation and Mediation Board, taking of strike vote, notice of strike vote, among others. So I will not go to the details of the procedural requirements, but note that hindi basta-basta yung strike. It needs to go through procedural formalities before it is allowed. If a strike is staged without following these procedures, then again, it's illegal. Next, the strike should be conducted through lawful means. So it simply means that the strike must be peaceful. So there should be no violence, no coercion, no intimidation involved. The striking employees cannot obstruct public roads or the entrance or exit of the company premises. If the strike was not peaceful, even if may valid ground, even if the procedural requirements are complied with, the strike is still illegal. And last one, if there's an agreement between the management and the union that disputes should be resolved through arbitration, that agreement should be followed. So they go to arbitration first to settle their dispute instead of staging a strike. If a strike is illegal, who is liable? Lahat ba ng employees who participated, are they all equally liable? So the answer to that is no. The liability of the employee who participated in the illegal strike depends on whether they are union officers or mere union members. For union officers, they can be dismissed for willful participation in the illegal strike. Mere participation, kahit wala silang na-commit na illegal act during the conduct of the strike, they can still be dismissed. But for mere union members, yung participation lang in the illegal strike is not a ground for their dismissal. It must first be shown that they committed an illegal activity during the strike, and there's substantial evidence to prove that. So that's the difference. Next, let's discuss work relations, employer-employee relationship. So when does it exist? Preliminary notes muna. Whether an employer-employee relationship exists between the parties is a question of fact, and it's determined by law, not by the agreement of the parties. So even if the agreement explicitly says that there is no employer-employee relationship between the parties, if the nature of the engagement clearly shows that such a relationship exists, then that provision in the agreement will have no effect. So the law will always prevail. Okay, so let's move on to the tests in determining the existence of employer-employee relationships. So I know you've all memorized this. You know it by heart, but let's just reiterate this for emphasis. So we have a mnemonic for this, remember? CHIPS. So the fourfold test. CHIPS. Control, hiring, power to dismiss, and salary payment. When all of these elements are present, an employer-employee relationship exists. So control is the most crucial and determinative test. And control here means not just over the end product or the output, but also as to the manner, the means, the methods, and the processes to be used by the employee in his work. Although it is not required for the employer to actually exercise this power of control. So it is sufficient that the power exists. Next is power to hire. So this can be expressed or implied. This power exists even if there's no formal hiring process, like exams or interviews, as long as the employee is engaged to perform services for the employer. Next one is the power to dismiss. Again, it is not necessary that this power be actually exercised. It is enough that this power exists. And last is the payment of salaries and wages. Another test used in determining employer-employee relationship is the economic dependency test. And this is used to supplement but not to replace the fourfold test. The test is if the employee is dependent on the job provided by the employer for continued livelihood, then it strengthens the claim that the employer employee relationship exists. So the two tests can also be combined, the fourfold test plus the economic dependency test, in what jurisprudence terms as the two-tiered test. Next, let's discuss the jurisdiction of the labor arbiter. For this one, let's just focus on the general principles, but not the specific cases falling within the labor arbiter's jurisdiction. As a general rule, employer-employee relationship is a condition precedent for the labor arbiter to exercise its jurisdiction. The exception is in the case of OFWs, because under the Migrant Workers Act, the labor arbiters has exclusive original jurisdiction over claims of OFWs, not only those arising from employer employee relationships, but also those claims by virtue of any law or contract involving OFWs, including claims for actual, moral, exemplary, or other types of damages. So we have certain tests. Labor arbiters have jurisdiction if the claim arose out of the employer employee relationship, or even if the claim did not arose directly from that relationship, there is at least a reasonable causal connection. Second, labor arbiters also have jurisdiction if the issue or the claim can be resolved or settled solely by applying labor laws. On the other hand, if the issue or the claim can be resolved by applying civil law principles, then it is not the labor arbiters, but the regular courts which have jurisdiction. One example of this is the violation of a non compete clause in the employment contract. A non compete clause is a common provision in employment contracts which prohibits the employee from engaging in activities that compete with the employer's business either during the employment or after employment for a specific period or within a certain geographic area. So let's say that after the employee resigned, he put up a same business as his former employer in violation of the non compete clause. The employer's claim for damages in that case, in that example, is within the jurisdiction of regular courts, not the labor arbiters, since the issue can be resolved by applying civil law principles. Last, if the employer employee relationship is merely incidental, then we must look at the main cause of action or the relief sought to determine which court has jurisdiction. So, for example, the employer granted housing loans to one of its employees, and the employee failed to pay the loan. So, the employer filed an action for sum of money. In that case, the employer employee relationship is merely incidental. It just so happens that the parties to the case are the employer and his employee. But that relationship is not the basis of the case. The cause of action is the collection of sum of money based on the loan. So in that example, the regular courts again have jurisdiction, not the labor arbiters. So the specific cases within the jurisdiction of the labor arbiters is enumerated in Section 224, formerly 217 of the Labor Code. So that wraps up our labor law last minute tip lecture for the 2025 bar exam. I hope this helped you recall some of the important labor law concepts for your day 2 exam. Good luck and see you in the next lecture.